الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد عبدك ورسولك نبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So, I mean, I've got the PowerPoint and the microphone going, but I don't want to make this too sort of formal as like a presentation here. We got a PowerPoint here to keep us on track, but I'd like to make this more interactive. We'll have some questions. We'll keep it as a discussion. We're going to discuss the topic. So the discussion of tonight is going to be obviously discrimination, civil rights, what rights do we have in various areas, whether it's in employment in the workplace, in your colleges, universities, if you're at a place of public accommodation, which we'll talk about, or also when you're approached by the FBI or some sort of federal officer, what rights do you have, what can you do? So like I said, I'm going to keep this more interactive than formal, and inshallah we can all benefit from this. Just a brief background about myself. I've been practicing in the area of civil rights for about 10 years now. I've done a couple of cases that were more high profile in the sense that they were on the news, and a lot of times civil rights cases tend to be on the news a lot. So you might have seen some cases, but some are a little bit older. The 6 Imams case, where you had the Imams that were stopped at the airport. I worked on that case. I worked on the 9/11 litigation, which is an ongoing major litigation. And there's a couple of cases that we've done recently that have also been in the news recently. You might have heard about, and we'll talk about them and how they fit in, and how it affects us. But inshallah, we'll get to the basics of it first. So I mean, discrimination. When we talk about discrimination under the law, and I want to preface this with one thing before actually. We live in a time right now where there seems to be an atmosphere of a lot of religious bias, racial bias, particularly against Muslims. There's a lot of propaganda against Muslims, and more and more, we're obviously all experiencing that, and we're seeing that happen. Nonetheless, the discrimination that we're going to talk about is one that's more, what the Constitution protects and what the law protects, state law and federal law, is what's manifest in specific areas, right? Public, whether it's in a public entity, or it's a employer, or it's a public accommodation, or it's a college, university, and your rights are being severely affected. What it doesn't cover, and I want to be clear, is just like an opinion that somebody might hold, right? A private person holding a private opinion is, you may find it offensive, or you may find it, finding upsetting, but that's something that they're also protected in having that and holding that. So I want to be very clear, like the discrimination that we're talking about is not that of a private person holding a private opinion. So we'll go ahead. I'm not going to read all that. It's a lot of dense text in there. I wanted to put that up there just so that you have an idea of where the law comes from. The source of the law in New Jersey is, we have two sources. One is the New Jersey Law Against Discrimination. This is a state law. The other is federal, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And these are the main sources from which we derive discrimination law and what discrimination is. And you can see here that it covers almost every single protected group: race, religion, national origin, ancestry, age. These are all the things, gender. These are all the things that are covered. So if you belong to one of these groups, you're known as what they call a protected class or a protected group. And if you're facing some sort of adverse action because of your membership in that group, then that's what we're talking about when it comes to discrimination. And as you mentioned, it applies to employment, housing, places of public accommodation, and loan applications and things like that. Here's a definition of public accommodation. We use that word quite a bit, public accommodation. What does it really mean? Sometimes a case will come down to like whether or not something constitutes a public accommodation or not. Generally, there's a list of things you can take a look at what we're talking about. Hotels, motels, a restaurant, any place that's open to the public, that's open for people to come in and go. These are generally places that are public accommodation. Included in that is colleges and universities, and that's very important because recently we saw a slew of cases that dealt with discrimination in colleges and universities, and so we'll talk about those as well. And again, like I said, private institutions, private clubs, religious organizations, educational facilities that are private, these are not, because if that was the case, then a masjid could be held to be discriminating if they didn't want to hire like a non-Muslim imam or something like that. So obviously there's a protection in private entities, religious organizations that are specifically made for that purpose. Yeah, we'll skip it. This is just a federal version of that same law. So let's just talk about employment first, and we'll talk about what constitutes discrimination in the workplace. And this is something that's probably the most common area when it comes to civil rights work. The majority of cases that we've seen comes in the area of employment law and employment discrimination. So what constitutes in order to simply be discriminated against, or what it means to be discriminated against, is that one, you belong to a protected group, which we mentioned, and it could be any protected group. We'll talk about religious discrimination. So you're a Muslim, you belong to a religion, and that's the protected group. And then there's some sort of adverse employment action that's happening, right? And when I say adverse employment action, it could be anything. It could be a refusal to hire, or it could be a refusal to give a promotion, or it could be giving directly a demotion that affects you, or it could be a negative evaluation. These are all adverse employment actions, right? So it could be any of these things. So you're a member of a protected group, some sort of adverse employment action is taken against you, and that adverse employment action is motivated due to your religion, right? It's because of your religion, right? If you can make that out, you've simply made out a case of discrimination. Then what happens next is that the employer would then have to say, although that may be true, but the reason we did this action was because of other reasons that are non-discriminatory and that have some sort of business purpose, a bona fide business purpose, right? So, somebody gets, let's say you go for a job interview and you're qualified and you're, more qualified than the other applicants, and then you're not hired, the job continues to be, remains to be open, or somebody much less qualified is hired, and you say, hey, the only thing that was different was that I was Muslim or something like that. Then the employer would, you've made out a case of discrimination right there. The employer then would have to say, although you're a Muslim and we didn't hire you, the reason we didn't hire you is because of X, Y, and Z, non-discriminatory, bona fide, this is for our, for the betterment of our business kind of criteria. And then, of course, that, they can't say that, oh, we don't want Muslims because that would hurt our business. That can't be a reason. But it would have to be some bona fide reason why we didn't hire you. And then, so that's basically what the anatomy of an employment discrimination case looks like. And yeah, we've seen this in a couple areas. Now, what types of discrimination are there? And these are the four main types of cases we'll see. One is called disparate treatment. Disparate treatment is very simple. You're employed somewhere and you're being treated differently than other people, right? So you're being treated differently than other similarly situated employees. And of course, the motivating factor for that is some sort of discriminatory animus because you're, you're a Muslim or you're Palestinian or you're black or so forth. You're being treated differently. So the main thing about this one is that here's how all the similarly situated employees are being treated, but you're being treated differently. You're being given differential treatment. That's disparate treatment. And we see this a lot. We'll see this a lot in gender discrimination cases where you have, a bunch of male employees, you have like one female employee, and like there's clear difference in how they're being treated. So we see that a lot. That's one type of case. A second case is disparate impact. Disparate impact is a larger level discrimination. This is not like one person is being discriminated against. This is a company has a policy, and this policy on the face of it is neutral, but the only people it affects is one group, right? It disparately affects one group of people. So it's as if this policy was intentionally created to discriminate. A good example of that is a case that I worked on, which is the MTA case. This is the New York MTA, and basically the New York City MTA had a rule that everybody had to wear MTA hats, right? You couldn't wear anything else. You had to wear the MTA hats. And which groups does this affect? It affects Muslim women, and it affects Sikhs. And they were the two plaintiff groups in that lawsuit. What made that discrimination? What made that even worse was that MTA employees that were wearing like Yankee hats were not disciplined or were not given any kind of warnings or anything like that. So maybe just lay down, yeah. So like, employees that were wearing Yankee hats or, whatever, nothing happened to them. But the Sikh employees wearing turbans and the Muslim women wearing hijabs were the ones that were, right. So now the policy is just like everybody should wear hats, the MTA hats. On the face of it, it's not discriminatory. It's a neutral sort of looking policy, but it only impacts one person. So that's what we mean by disparate impact. The third one is a hostile work environment. A hostile work environment most frequently we see this in sexual harassment. This is where this comes up the most. Basically, what's happening here is you're employed at a job. You're doing your job. You have no issues with the job. Your coworkers, your supervisor, people around you are making comments about Muslims or religion in a negative way, right? They may not even be talking to you directly, but they're making sure that you can hear them. They're saying things that are derogatory. They're saying things that can be seen as threats. They're saying things that Muslims are terrorists and so forth. And they're doing that day after day after day. And so you're faced with this hostile work environment day after day after day. And you've complained to HR or whoever the supervisor is, and they've noted your complaint, but they've done nothing, and you continue to be facing this hostile work environment. So that then constitutes a discriminatory claim for hostile work environment, and that's actionable. But it has to be more than one offhand comment here and there. It's got to be something that happens day after day. It's like a regular pattern in practice. Most frequently, we see this in sexual harassment cases where it's a woman, she just has an uncomfortable work environment. And the last one is retaliation. This is interesting because retaliation is not in itself about discrimination. It's just about how the employer behaves towards you as a result of your complaining about discrimination. Retaliation basically means that if the employer takes an action against you simply for complaining about discrimination or complaining about anything or doing anything that it's a protected right of yours, and they've taken action because of that, then that's actionable. And this is a big one because courts hate this. Courts and judges, they absolutely hate retaliation, and they punish this. They punish the people quite severely for retaliation. So, for example, let's say that you're at work and your supervisor has made some comments about Muslims that's derogatory, that's offensive. He's made these comments in public. The comments are affecting your employment, affecting how your coworkers see you. You go to HR and you file a complaint, say, supervisor X, Y, and Z. As a result of you filing a complaint, your supervisor demotes you or gives you a bad evaluation or even fires you. That's retaliation because you can say that you did something that was protected. Your right of complaining about discrimination or any sort of conduct is protected, and for them to take an action against you because of that is retaliation. Now, what if and I've seen this a lot. Somebody's kind of overreacting, right? So let's say somebody says something, could be about something happened in the news. It's not really offensive. It's not really discrimination. They just made a comment. Somebody's there. They're Muslim. They kind of overreact. They're like, oh, this is offensive and all this stuff, and they go and complain to HR, right? And then, so as a result of that, the supervisor still gets upset and takes an adverse action against you. Is that retaliation? It is, because, and we've seen this a lot, that the original complaint about discrimination was actually quite weak, where the original discrimination, there wasn't really much there to show discrimination. But because the employer took an action as a result of the complaint, then it becomes retaliation. And like I said, retaliation is actually punished more severely. So it became a case more strongly on retaliation than it was on the initial discrimination itself. So, employers, even if your complaint is weak, employer still doesn't have right to take an action against you because of the complaint. HR will obviously they'll look at the complaint. If it's really weak, they'll throw it out. It'll be taken care of, if you're in the right type of employment setting. So that's the last type we see. Okay. One of the questions that I get a lot, people ask me I'm working and can I ask my employer, if I can get time to pray or if I can go to Jummah on Fridays. And so this is, the answer to this is this concept of the religious accommodation. And the law basically holds, let me just go next slide. Yeah. The law basically holds that an employer has to make a reasonable accommodation if you have a sincerely held religious belief and you're asking for an accommodation at your job. An employer must make that accommodation if the accommodation you're asking for does not place an undue hardship on the employer, right? Meaning that your request to, for example, to pray Dhuhr is not jeopardizing the nature of the employer's business itself, right? It's not an undue hardship. It's too burdensome for the employee. For the employer. If it's not, then the employer has to provide it. They have to provide this accommodation. So if you say, look, I'm going to go, make wudu and pray in the corner, normally in most office jobs and most jobs of that nature, you taking 5 minutes to go to the corner and pray should not be an undue hardship on the nature of the business itself. Now, there may be some jobs where that might jeopardize, and that's something that they have to kind of look at. And there might be some times when the employer can look at, well, is there an alternative? You're asking for this, but maybe we can give you this or something like that. And then that's the kind of back and forth they have to do. But the employer has to give it if it's employer can't deny it just because they feel like it or just because they don't want to, right? They can't deny that. Most commonly, usually praying is not the hard part. I don't know if you guys can correct me if wrong if anybody has an experience where they had trouble praying at work. Going to Jummah on Fridays sometimes tends to be more problematic for people. You have a job where you simply can't be away for that long, right? Sometimes like the 45 minutes here, but then going back and forth between the masjid, you could be away for an hour and a half, hour 15, hour and a half. So, that tends to be a burden, and that's the thing that you have to look at on a case-by-case basis. Like, how compelling is it for the employer to say that you absolutely have to be here? You cannot be away from the office for this time period, and that's what we have to look at. Now, this is something that we do on a case-by-case basis, so it can't be, I can't give a general answer, but this is the general standard. The standard is there an undue hardship with the employer? If no, the employer has to give it. They have to give it. So, here's just basically some things, right? If it doesn't pose undue hardship, employer accommodates. If you request an accommodation that does pose an undue hardship, but there's alternatives, the employer has to offer you alternatives. If you request an accommodation that that does pose an undue hardship, then the employer doesn't have to give it to you, right? And so we have to keep going back and forth and looking at what is a undue hardship. All right, so here's a couple of cases that we have. These are a couple of real cases, and we'll just read over these fact scenarios, and you guys can take a guess whether or not this went in the favor of the employee or the employer. So the first one is a woman works at a hospital, refuses to take an influenza vaccine, which is a requirement of the hospital, because the vaccine had pork byproduct. Hospital offers a pork-free, non-gelatin vaccine, but employee declines. Employee requests a position within the hospital for which she is not required to take a vaccine. Employee is terminated. What do you guys think? Discriminatory or not? No, that's right. So the court rules in the favor of the employer in that one, because they made the accommodations, they gave her the alternatives, and she declines. Second one, police department denied a Muslim female officer's request to wear a khimar over her uniform, stating that it violated their uniform regulation, which prohibited all officers from wearing religious dress or symbols. Police commissioner stated that it was important to promote the image of an impartial police force free from expressions of personal religion or bias. Discrimination or not? No. Discrimination? So court rules in the favor. No, it doesn't cover the face. So court rules in the favor of the employer in this one, because they see that the employer's reasoning to have the impartial was important to the employer. So they ruled in favor because that's an undue hardship. Similarly, like in the MTA case that we talked about, that case did eventually settle, where they kind of what the MTA started doing was they started issuing a khimar that has because the MTA's case was that, well, the employees have to be identifiable. Like people should be identified who's the MTA employee. So then they started issuing a khimar that has the MTA logo on it. And that was one of the settlements they made. For the Sikh employees, that was a little bit tougher, because in the Sikh religion, it was offensive for them to have, like a logo on their turban. So it was a little bit more difficult in that one. Okay, next one. Muslim woman who wear a headscarf applied for a position at Abercrombie store. The manager found that the woman was qualified for the position, but was concerned that her headscarf would conflict with Abercrombie's look policy. Manager decided not to hire the applicant. That's discrimination. You guys might have heard of this case. It's made the news a bit. Yeah, that one's a discrimination, because although they have a look policy, it's kind of arbitrary, and they can't produce compelling evidence that their look policy affects their actual business, right? The next one is a woman told she could wear her hijab, but not at the front counter near customers, where she would interact and possibly offend customers. Woman refused to remove her hijab and was terminated. Yeah, that's absolutely. Yeah, that was discrimination. And one of the things the MTA case that keeps coming up, one of the things that the MTA did was when the Muslim women in that case said that they didn't want to wear they had to wear their hijab or their khimar, was that it demoted them to the train yards and the bus yards, so that they couldn't be working driving the buses or the trains. They had to go back. And our client was driving the buses, and they put her back in the train yards and the bus yard, and those are like really, really tough jobs, and those are more physically demanding, and she actually got injured doing that, and just because they wanted to take her away from any kind of passengers. So that was absolutely discrimination. This is just a note that we'll mention, is that a lot of times people face discrimination, and they're afraid to come forward for many reasons. One of the reasons that people are afraid to come forward is because they feel like hiring an attorney and going through litigation and going through the whole process is very costly, and that it's going to be a big burden on them to even bring this, and which is one of the reasons why the legislation has included this Section 1988, which says that if you bring a case of discrimination, and the New Jersey state also has a similar statute in there, and you're the prevailing party, then your employer or whoever you're taking action against is going to be required to cover your attorney's fees. And this sort of shifting of the burden of the attorney's fees is important because it allows people to come forward and bring their cases without fearing, then it would, obviously it would be biased against people who can't afford attorneys, and that can be pretty costly. So it's just something to mention, that this is one of the roadblocks that the legislation has taken away from, people, that the attorney's fees will be covered. So, that's just, basic nutshell, like here's the law about discrimination. And, I'll talk about it a little bit more from my experience. I had a client recently, and this case was also in the news, so some of you might have heard about it, where she was in a college. She was going to a community college, and she got A's on her exams, and she got, submitted her papers, got A's and did well. It was an easy class. It was supposed to be an easy A professor. And then she looks at her grade, and it's an F. And the professor, during the class, the professor had been one who, and this is a marketing class, but the professor talks a lot about, ISIS and terrorists and Muslims this and that, and it has nothing to do with class, but she's constantly talking about it. And the student was the only Muslim person in that class. So, during that class, she had actually challenged her professor, like, you can't be talking about Muslims and terrorists interchangeably like that, right? It's kind of like offensive. And then, of course, the result of that was that she got an F. Like a just straight up F, not even like a C or something, even though she had very clearly gotten A's on her exams. So this is a case that we took, and when we put it out there, it made the news and kind of went viral for a bit. But what was, to me, was most compelling about it was that the client, when she came to me, she didn't really think that there was a big thing here, right? She just thought that the school is just screwing me over. Can you help me talk to the school and fix the grade, right? And I was like, this is a major discrimination issue because, two things. One is not only did the professor do that, there was also, a lack of the school itself trying to correct it because she had gone for the grade appeal, and there was a, very bad policy and procedure there. So, one thing, she didn't think that is a big deal. Then I was talking to her about it, and she was obviously affected by this. She had done her work, and she had, earned her grade, and she didn't get it. She got an F, and it was going to affect her terribly. In talking to her, one of the things she told me was that she's kind of used to this, that she's kind of used to the idea that people don't like Muslims or people will do that, right? And so, I just wanted to bring that up. You don't want to get used to that because this is the last thing you want to get used to, right? You want to fight against that, and there's a lot of avenues for us to do it. The law is here to protect you. The New Jersey state law protects us. The federal law protects us. And so we have to take an action against that and speak up and not really sit back and just, take it. So that's something I would definitely encourage. When you face discrimination in employment, as we talked about, one of the first things you have to do is you have to file a charge with a complaint with the EEOC, which is a federal commission that basically takes in complaints for employment discrimination. And the EEOC itself has the power to investigate and make determinations about whether there's discrimination or not. So, the EEOC is there, and it's usually friendly for people to go, without a lawyer. They can, you can go and they'll give you a form and you can fill it out and you can file that complaint. And what that does is that it protects your rights. It protects your rights and it preserves your rights. Because if you don't file with the EEOC within 180 days of when that discrimination took place, then you lose your right to bring that in a lawsuit. So it's very important for people to complain, to keep records, to put things on the record, to put things in writing, to file the proper procedures and complaints, which is what we want to encourage here. If you're facing discrimination, my advice, if you see that you're facing discrimination, put things in writing. Put things into emails. Email people saying, this is what happened. Put it into HR in writing. Get responses from them in writing. If they respond to you verbally or over the phone or something like that, send an email, have that conversation, and then send an email back immediately saying that as per our conversation, you said blah, blah, blah. Send it to them. Put everything in writing, document everything, because the hardest thing is going back and trying to trace verbal and oral conversations. But everything is documented, then we have it right there. So if you find yourself facing some kind of discriminatory conduct, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in a college or a university, and like I said, the same college that we had filed a lawsuit against, a little bit later came, and there was another student that came forward, and another sort of discriminatory conduct had taken place. The professor had accused one of the students of making a terroristic threat against her, simply because she wears a hijab. And there was no documentation of anything happening. The witnesses said, nothing happened there. And she had gone to the police station to file that the student had made a terroristic threat. She had told the deans in the school itself. So this is going to obviously adversely affect, and for Muslims that adversely affects, reports to the police and FBI about terrorism affects Muslims way more disproportionate than anybody else, and it can actually ruin somebody's life. So this is, and that same college came back with that. So if you're in college and you feel like there's discriminatory conduct from the professor or for the administration or somebody, put things in writing, document things. And file complaints. Go in, most colleges have an internal department, EEO department that you can file a complaint with. So definitely file complaints internally. If it's in the workplace, go to HR, go to your supervisor, whoever is responsible for taking those kind of complaints. Put them in writing, put the complaint out there, try to find ways to correct it. I know that in most jobs you don't want to be that guy, that's always complaining or that's always doing that. So you have to kind of use your discretion. But if there's something that's seriously adversely affecting you, and it's specifically because of your religion or your national origin, then you have to document it, right? If it's something that has to do with you, and this is another point I'll make, if you have somebody, a supervisor, who's just mean, and they're just mean to everybody, then that's not discrimination. That's just somebody being a jerk. And people come to me and they'll say oh, this person is discriminating against me because of that. And I was like, do they treat other people? Yeah, she's a jerk to everybody. And I was like, well done. She's not discriminatory then. Because there's no law that protects from somebody being a jerk, right? The laws only protect discriminatory conduct. So you have to kind of make that discernment. Is this discriminatory? Is this person just a jerk to everybody? Or is it specifically to me? Is it targeted because of discriminatory animus, because of my national origin, because of my religion? And if so, then you have to document it. Then you have to complain. Then you have to put that in writing on the record. So definitely I would encourage that, and if there's more questions, I'll take those a little bit later about the discrimination in the civil sense. Just briefly, I want to touch upon the issue about what happens when law enforcement or FBI in particular is coming to you. I'm not a criminal attorney. I've dealt with a couple of FBI cases because these come up. FBI cases, they're not exactly criminal. It's usually the FBI is doing some kind of information gathering. And if you followed, I don't know how many of you followed the whole NYPD surveillance thing that came out in 2012. And did anybody follow what happened after that? Does anybody know what the end result of that was? By show of hands. Everybody remembers NYPD spying, right? Okay. Does anybody remember what happened? What's the end result? No. So we'll get to that. So what that case showed us was that the NYPD and the FBI, they're more interested in data than anything else, right? They're not interested necessarily in putting people behind bars. They're very, very interested in data, information, right? And this is the era of data, and data is king and everything. So usually when the FBI is coming, they're coming to collect data. They're coming to collect data and collect information about everything and anything they can. So it's not really criminal where they're trying to find things to do, but it could be, and it teeters on that range of criminal or not. So it's important. Now, recently we had that terrorist attack in New York City, where you had the individual who crashed the car and was, and that person, he went to the Patterson Masjid Omar, and I believe also his his child attended one of the Islamic school, not Islamic schools, one of the schools in Passaic, I believe. So whenever something like that happens, then the FBI is going to be all over the people that come to that masjid. So they'll be all over the people that come to that masjid, the people that attend that school, all the connection relations, they're all over it. You know, I dealt with this more firsthand. How many of you remember the underwear bomber case? Y'all remember that? Yeah. So that particular person who was the quote-unquote underwear bomber had gone to an Al-Maghrib, what is it, Ilm Fest, which is like their big event in Houston, I believe, right? So he had attended that, right? Now, that's like Al-Maghrib's big event where like people come from all over the country there. So there's a lot of people there, a lot. So once they found out that piece of information that he had gone there, now the FBI had tracked every single person that had gone there, okay? And every single person that attended it, and then the agents were kind of like going to people's homes like simultaneously, like at the same time. And Al-Maghrib put out this statement saying that, you know, such and such is the case, and we encourage everyone to cooperate with law enforcement, which sounds okay, but it was terrible advice, because what people started doing was they said, oh, well, if Al-Maghrib is saying I should just talk to the feds when they come to my door, which is awful advice. So we don't have the slide, but if I had to put up one slide to tell you how to deal with the feds, there's it's one sentence. Don't talk to the feds. Like, do not talk to them. That's it. There's no other advice. I mean, it's not very complicated. It's the simplest advice I can give. Don't talk to the feds. That's it. There's no business. You have no business talking to them. Okay? Now, does that mean that you can avoid having to answer them? No, you can't avoid it, but you don't talk to them, right? What ultimately happened in that case was one of the clients who had been to the Al-Maghrib seminar, he was like, you know, Al-Maghrib's advice doesn't seem quite right. Let me call a lawyer. So he called our office. And when he called me, so he told me that the feds came to his house. They were asking him a lot of questions. The questions were, you know, not normal in nature. There were things like, oh, do you know so-and-so, or do you know so-and-so, or do you know so-and-so, things like that. And, you know, what do you believe about X, Y, and Z? And he said, like, you know, he didn't feel right. He didn't feel comfortable talking to them, which is the proper way to feel. And so he basically took their card, and he called me, and he said, I'm going to have my lawyer call you. He called me. I called the FBI agents right back. So he told me when they came, they were asking like a million questions. He called me. I called the FBI agents. I said, hey, you know, I'm the attorney for this guy. You know, when you want to set up a meeting, come to my office. So then they, you know, they said, sure. So they came to my office. I brought my client in, prepped my client. We went into that. We went into the meeting. The FBI asked him, like, what's your name? What's your address? Showed him a picture of the underwear bomber. Have you seen this guy? He said no. They said, okay, thank you, and they left, right? So, and then that's one case. In another case, same thing. Somebody called me and said, like, hey, the FBI called me. So I called the FBI agent. I was like, hey, you know, here's my client. I'll make him available. And the FBI was like, no, it's okay. Never mind. We don't really, not interested. So, you know, so basically they were on a fishing expedition. They were trying to gather data. They're trying to collect data. They're trying to find out who's who, what's what. If they can talk directly with the person, then they'll talk to them. And the lawyer gets involved. The FBI knows that, you know, they can't sort of pull anything and just ask any questions they want. So either they're going to come and ask, you know, briefly, or they're not going to ask anything and they're going to let it go. So my advice, if the FBI, you know, especially after this thing, they're coming in to Patterson, they're finding out people went to Masjid Omar, they're going to people's houses, and, you know, I'm sure that's happening right now. Do not talk to the FBI. If they come to your house, do not let them in. For some reason, I mean, actually I know the reason. Muslims, they want to be hospitable, they want to be nice. You bring some, you know, FBI comes knocking at your door, you invite them inside for tea or water. Do not do that. Don't do that. Because what they're going to do is they're going to come inside, they're going to start looking around, they're going to start collecting data, and they're going to start, you know, you don't know what they're going to start doing. So do not let them in. They come to your door, you go outside, you close your door, you talk to them, and what you say to them is, identify yourself. They say, hey, we want to talk to you. Say, look, I'll take your card, and I'll have my lawyer call you. That's it. You don't have to say anything more than that. They're going to ask you more questions. They're going to say things like, you know, just 5 minutes, we just have a couple of questions. You know, it's not a big deal. You don't need to get lawyers involved. Don't, yeah, just say, look, I'll take your card, and I'll have my lawyer call you. That's it. Don't say anything else. They shouldn't be coming to your employment, although I've had one incident of that where the FBI came to somebody's work. They shouldn't be doing that. If they do that, same thing. You know, you're not talking to them. Mostly they come to your house, and that's the way. And if anybody, you know, like this is one piece of advice that, like, go tell everybody that you know. That's it. Like there's no other way around it. Like that's the only way you can deal with it. We have these little little cards here, and if interested, you can take some. And on the back, it kind of gives you some of your rights. This one is particularly about immigration, which is what happens if ICE officers come to your house, which is something else we've seen lately. What you can do. It also applies to FBI. And then over here, we have a little thing that you can just cut off a little card, and you can keep this with you. And if you're approached by a law enforcement or FBI or ICE officer, and you can just sort of give them this and say, "This is my lawyer." You can contact them. And on the back here, it has like a brief information about your rights that you would know. So we have these around, and you can take these. And if you have any questions, about that, obviously we can take them. So I think that's it for as far as my formal presentation goes. I'll open it up for questions and answers, and we can have more of a discussion. Sheikh.
By staying later at work on that day. But then after he got the job, his supervisor was giving him, and other people who hired him, giving him a really hard time about going out for this situation. It seemed like when you were explaining undue hardship, it seemed that it's not something clear cut completely. How do you establish that there's undue hardship without actually filing a lawsuit against them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like that's it's a good question, and like so just to be clear, like lawsuit is not the first step you take. If you have an issue with an employer, you're going to go to your internal procedures first. You're going to go to the supervisor directly. You can go to HR if you have a company that has an HR department. You go to HR and talk to them first. If you come to a lawyer like myself and ask me for advice, I'm not going to say like, okay, let's start a lawsuit tomorrow. We're going to say, look, we'll write a letter to HR. We'll write letters and we'll try to discuss this. And so that's the steps you take. Like lawsuit is like the very last thing. Like they've like, this is like the end of the road and there's no way you can resolve this and now we're going to file a lawsuit. So, the lawsuit is not the last possible step. But yeah, I mean, that's the way you would do it, right? You'd have to go through your mechanisms, right? And undue hardship is something that we have to look at on a case-by-case basis depending on the nature of the job. Now, if the person was hired and the hiring people obviously knew the position, understood what the position was, and they said, yeah, this is fine, you can go for an hour and then you stay an extra hour on Fridays, that kind of shows you that there's not going to be an undue hardship in that case for that job because the people who understood the position said that was okay. Now, if a person comes in later and he's telling him not to do it, but he's just, that person can't articulate a reason why, that person can't say you can't go because of X, Y, and Z reason, then, it doesn't meet the standard of undue hardship. If he says, you can't go because of X, Y, Z is happening at this moment and you need to be here for that, that's a different story. Then, we would look at that and, hopefully you would talk to HR and try to resolve it through there, or you talk to your supervisor, try to resolve it there. If you can, you come to an attorney like myself, we'll probably, write a letter and say, look, hey, try to resolve it. And then if we can't, and if we determine as lawyers that, hey, look, no, this is a hardship on the employer, then, we might say, like, you have to find some other way of doing this. Yeah.
So about discrimination with the mandate of allowing the same-sex marriage, say if, for example, two Muslim men or two Muslim women, they come to the mosque and say, we want our marriage officiated by the imam. Would this be a case of discrimination against the mosque if the mosque refuses, even though it's from a private entity?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. This is like this is a compelling issue, and this is like a cutting edge issue, and this is something that I don't think we've seen. Have we seen? I don't think we've seen a case like this yet, and I wouldn't be surprised if we will see a case like this very soon. Oh, we said that happened? I can see this case, like, so it depends on how this case works out, right? I think that if the masjid is a state, is also like issuing the state marriage license, right? If the imam is acting in the capacity of the person who's also issuing a state license, then there's an issue as to like what that means, right? Because then you may have to make some, you may have to make an allowance for that. If the masjid is kind of disconnected from that whole state procedure and it's not doing that, it's not involved with that, it's just this religious kind of obligation, then it'll be a different issue. But a masjid can be, so when he said a masjid can be sued as a private sort of club, a masjid may be sued for discrimination if it's being discriminatory for something that's other than the purpose that it's built for, right? So you can have discrimination issues in a masjid. If it's like if they say this is a Muslim center or Islamic center, but we don't let any Bengalis in here. This is something that can become an issue. But this is this is a Palestinian cultural center, and we want Palestinian cultural kind of issues, and that that's how you're identifying your private club. Then that's kind of a different story. But I do sense that we'll see more of these kind of litigations coming up. Again, like I said, you can commence the litigation on anything. I can see that one going, depending on the kind of the more the facts on that a little bit more might be different. Yes, brother.
I can speak to the first question with regard to being released for time relative to my suggestion is to get that right. I worked at university for 30 years, so I've hired a lot of people, and I know people have asked for specific accommodations. What happens is that HR will say one thing,
Yeah.
the department that you work for,
We'll say something else. Yeah.
the best thing to do is get for anyone here at Clifton that to go ahead and start, because once I send out a confirmation letter, hiring someone, I will put those specific things in place.
Yeah, the first thing that I would say that you should remember from here is don't talk to the feds. The second thing I would say you remember from here is put things in writing. Put everything in writing. Document as much as you can. Confirm things. Confirm oral and verbal conversations, telephone conversations. Confirm them with an email. Confirm them with some sort of writing, a letter or something like that. So yeah, definitely putting things in writing, best way to go.
What can you do to stop moving this move so much, which could lead to a cause or us with competition, state corporation, and example of anything within the law
Yeah.
stop before it's so much harm.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I mean, so I'll just repeat the question in case anybody to hear. The brother's asking, what can we do to stop some of the vitriol that we hear on the radio or on the news or on TV against Muslims, particularly from radio show hosts and conservative radio show hosts and things like that. So you're correct. This is there is a freedom of speech and freedom of press, so there's not much you can do, and especially if they make them. There's a lot of protection if they're putting themselves out as journalists and this is media. These kind of battles, I don't even think belong in the legal kind of landscape. They belong. This is a media battle, and I think that you combat this with media on your side and trying to battle it that way, because you're fighting over public opinion, and that's going to be played out in the court of media. When it comes legally, the only time, I'll comment on this because I've sort of had the same thought, and we've kind of strategized as to what some of the things that we can do. The only time that you can really do anything is if the threat of harm or the threat of violence is very clear and very imminent, right? So if they're making threats like, we have to kill all these Muslims, or on XYZ day we're going to go and walk into a masjid with guns and if it's very, very imminent threat of harm, it's very clear violence, then you can do it. Now, most of these people try to steer clear of that. You'll see that very carefully they steer clear of that. You'll see in their comment section a lot of vitriol, and you'll see a lot more threats in their comment section, but the people themselves stay very clear of those kind of threats. And they're very sort of, they try to balance on that thing. And one of the things they do is they try to, they're accusing Muslims of being violent. So they try themselves to show that, that they're not. They're trying to get rid of Muslims because Muslims are violent, and that's their kind of like thing. But yeah, I mean, like you'll see the comment section and people say like, oh, we should get rid of them all, we should kill them all, but like they can't be held responsible for their comment section. Although it is compelling to me because I think if they're, this is an argument that we were considering, is that if their comment section, the people that are their regular followers are themselves making threats or sending threats or whatever, that we can make an argument that there's something about them that they're instigating this kind of violence, or they're kind of like keeping that up. Whether or not that will hold up, I don't know. I doubt it, but we haven't seen that tested yet. Yes. So audio recordings, like, you have to be one of the parties involved in the audio recording, right? So you can't record like a conversation which you're not a part of, right? And then when it comes to audio recording as evidence, there's just, in the rules of evidence, there's just a thing where you have to authenticate, right? So everything has to be authenticated, whether it's a document or it's a recording or it's an email or something like that, that this, and you have to do this by like proving that who was in the chain of possession of this particular recording, like it went to you, to whom, and that nobody had a chance to edit it, and they might call in somebody to authenticate that, yes, this is in fact the authentic recording and all that kind of stuff. So you face some challenges with authentication. And then the other thing I said, that you're one of the people involved in the in the conversation that you're recording, because otherwise, you're overstepping there. But that's basically it. Yes. Yeah, the list definitely exists. And this was a program that was started post 9/11, and it got very big at one point. I think in the Bush era, the first Bush era, it wasn't that big. It got really big, then it got completely out of hand to the point of becoming almost useless. There is a way to get off the list. You have to contact Homeland Security, and there's a way that they can you have to contact them about this and send a letter and give you information, and then they check you out, they vet you out, make sure that you're not the person who they were looking for, and all this kind of stuff, and they will eventually take you off of that list if that's possible. The no-fly list. So there's two lists. There was like this NCERS list, which is like really big, and there's a no-fly list, which is a lot harder to get off of, right? And when we had the Trump campaign, we heard a lot about this Muslim registry and this kind of stuff, and people were getting all crazy about it. Well, that was in fact the Muslim registry. It existed. That was a structure that existed. That was the purpose of it. So what Trump was saying had already happened post 9/11. There already was a Muslim registry, and basically what he would have done is just keep it, maybe make it a little bit bigger. But yeah, that's and a lot of the reason for that is to keep a registry of people. But yeah, there's a no-fly list, which is going to be very hard for you to get off of, because this is, it's not like a list that's available. You can't go and Google no-fly list and see who's on there. It exists, it's secret, and you find out in like the worst time. There's another list which prevents you from flying, or it subjects you to further scrutiny when you're flying, and you get pulled. I used to be on that list. It was impossible for me to fly. I couldn't even I couldn't do the electronic check-ins. I mean, I would be able to fly eventually, but like I had to do a lot. I have to get there much earlier. I have to do all this weird stuff, and then before I could even get in. But like I contacted DHS, and I was able to get off that list. But the no-fly list is far more secret, and it's far more difficult to get off that if you end up being on there. And like I'll just bring up a quick point. I know this discussion wasn't about surveillance, and it wasn't about I don't want to call it discrimination, but this is just sort of like governmental action, and we weren't really talking about that. But I'll take a moment here to make a point about that, because this is an issue that comes up, and this is an issue that the Muslims community tends to ignore for some reason. I don't know why. We tend to make light of it, and in the American community in general, I think the American community are also not fully aware of the depth of government surveillance, and to the how far it's gotten and where it's going. So, I mentioned the NYPD surveillance earlier. Obviously, all of you heard about it, and then the surveillance ran deep. I mean, there were people that, the NYPD was like, there was a guy who was shopping for like an engagement ring for his wife, and they were like recording, that whole incident of him and his wife shopping for an engagement ring. I mean, like, that's how deep the surveillance ran. I mean, the other story was about they went on like a rafting trip with like an MSA and all these kind of things, just writing everything down, recording everything, and that surveillance ran pretty deep. And it wasn't just masjids, it was people, it was homes, it was businesses that were Muslim owned. And when that case came to litigation, it was being litigated by the ACLU. And the ACLU came to a settlement agreement with the NYPD. And the settlement agreement basically said that, that they would basically restructure NYPD's surveillance abilities. But it didn't take away their surveillance ability, just sort of like made like a form around it, like just made it more formal. And it was terrible. And the Muslim community was very divided on this issue, particularly in New York City, because some people who had brought the ACLU in were kind of pro-settlement, like, oh, this is a landmark settlement, because we quote code one, which is, you don't win the case if you're settling, but like, and so they were very happy with this, and I was like, look, if NYPD is willing to settle, it's going to be terrible. And then we looked at it, and it was terrible, because they weren't taking away surveillance. They were putting in a lot of different like things, but they weren't taking away the surveillance at all. And so the Muslim community was quite divided. We actually went to court, the Southern District Court, where the judge basically allowed for public commentary on the settlement form, because this was good of the judge, because he realized that this is going to affect more than just the people that are litigating this case, because this is going to affect everybody in New York. So he kind of opened it up for comment, and a couple of organizations took the lead on this. I was there, there was a couple other people that were there, and then just commenting on how the settlement is not going to work. And this is the first time that I've seen this happen, where you had people that are not party to the litigation could defeat a settlement that was agreed upon by the litigants in that case. And the judge ultimately overruled and said the settlement would not stay because it wasn't strong enough to protect. It forced them to go back and litigate, and then they came back with another version of the settlement, which personally I thought was better, but still not that great. And that's the end of that case, and that's how it ended. So it ended with a settlement ultimately. There was a battle over it, and what surprised me about that little battle over that settlement was that a lot of Muslims were okay with NYPD surveillance, right? So long as they got a couple of tossed them a small things here and there. And there was a lot of like high profile, people in our community who were for it, who were kind of like getting people all pumped up about the settlement, and it kind of downplays the NYPD surveillance. And the NYPD surveillance is just scratching the surface, right? We know that there's a lot of surveillance here where we live in New Jersey. We know there's federal level surveillance when it comes from the NSA and all that kind of stuff. So I think surveillance is a big issue. I think the whole idea of like lists and developing lists, it's an issue that runs deep, and it's an issue that Muslims and Americans in general don't pay as much attention to, right? We get distracted by a lot of other smaller issues, but like this is the issue of the day. Ultimately, it's my belief. So if you have the opportunity to be involved in that area, to speak up against surveillance and to look at that issue, like that's going to be the issue of the day. So that's all I'll say about that. Any questions from the sisters? Okay, inshallah. So we'll wrap it up, inshallah. I'll be around. Tariq is here as well. Feel free to talk to us privately afterwards. Inshallah, we'll be happy to answer. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Jazakumullah khair, says Tariq Hussain, for the wonderful presentation and for coming to our community and giving us some instruction on these issues. Jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, we're going to continue next Friday with our regular program about Sayyidina Umar at the same time. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Feel free to take tea and coffee and some of the snacks while you're on the way out.
Thank you.